Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on Safety Risk Assessment in Practice. My name is Stuart Mader and I lead the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, or PTASP, Technical Assistance Center within FTA's Office of Transit Safety and Oversight. We're also joined by Andrew Lofton, the contractor supporting FTA's PTASP Technical Assistance Center. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A box. FTA will review these questions and provide answers at the end of our presentation. These slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on the PTASP Technical Assistance Center's resource library within a couple of days. Our objective for this webinar is to review key challenge areas for safety risk assessment in practice and provide examples of ways agencies can address these challenges. After this presentation, participants should be able to explain how data supports the safety risk assessment approach for analyzing risk, describe challenges associated with using quantitative and qualitative data in safety risk assessment activities, and describe how risk ratings support decision-making. And now, Andrew will review the agenda and key topics. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. And again, my name is Andy Lofton, and I wanted to cover our agenda for today. We're going to have four main sections. We'll kick off today discussing data fundamentals related to safety risk assessment. And then we're going to talk about some of the challenges that agencies may face as you perform safety risk assessment, specifically in dealing with data. And then we're going to talk about the output, our safety risk ratings that we determine as a result of our safety risk assessment. And then finally, as we do with all of our PTASP TAC webinars, we have a portion of the webinar set aside to answer questions from our participants. And also, I'm really excited to be able to tell everyone that we're going to be joined today by two industry speakers. And that's Elizabeth Presutti, the CEO of the Des Moines Area Regional Transit Authority, and also Serena Stevenson, the General Manager from WACO Area Transit. And the cool thing about today is we're not just going to go to our speakers once, we're actually going to hear from them multiple times to talk about specific topics that we're covering during our presentation. So we're really excited and grateful to have Elizabeth and Serena with us today. Also wanted to take a moment to point out some resources and also mention that our webinar today, we're going to try to talk about with a little more granularity on some specific subjects. And so we won't spend as much time as we normally do covering the basics and reviewing very general concepts. So we do want to point out that FTA has published a considerable amount of resources on the PTASP regulation. And specifically, there are sections devoted to safety risk management and safety assurance on the PTASP TAC website. So we would encourage folks to visit that website if you're looking for materials, especially if you're interested in a refresher on any of the topics that we're going to cover today. Also, I do need to mention that completely understand that some of you may have questions about the new bipartisan infrastructure law. If you do have questions about the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're going to encourage you to visit the website that FTA has set up to provide information regarding the new legislation. And that's www.fta.dot.gov/BIL. And also there is an email address, you can see it on your screen, and that is an inbox that FTA has established to capture any questions from the industry regarding the new bipartisan infrastructure law. And now with that out of the way, I'm going to pass the microphone back over to Stuart to talk a little bit about our feedback process. Stuart?
Thanks, Andy. Just want to take a minute before we get into topics of today's webinar to thank everybody who filled out the survey that we included at the end of February's webinar. Introduce these surveys so that we can hear more of your feedback and help us use that feedback to develop and deliver resources and tools that are most relevant to your needs. And based on your feedback, as you'll see in the webinar today, we're doing a few things. One is we're evolving the webinar format so that you'll hear from more voices throughout the presentation, including and especially the industry speakers who are going to offer their insight and perspective throughout the webinar. And we've also integrated audience polls. We're using the polling feature that's in Zoom. And you'll see these polls at some key points throughout the webinar, giving you opportunities to contribute to the presentation as we go. And in fact, we're going to do one of those polls right now. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen momentarily. And this poll asks about your level of involvement in your agency's safety risk management process. And there's 5 options to choose from. Then we'll move right in and talk about the results. Great. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Andy.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart. And thanks to all our participants for jumping on our first poll. And as we can see from our results, the folks we have participating today do have a considerable amount of involvement with the safety risk management process at their agency. And that's really great because we're going to get into some details about SRM specifically. Of course, we're going to focus on SRA today. And it's good to know that our audience are folks that interact with these processes. So again, thank you for your contribution and stay tuned for some more polling opportunities. And with that, let's get started. So when we talk about any PTASP requirements, we always find it's a good place to start in thinking about where that requirement sits within the overall structure of SMS or the overall SMS framework. Now, as a reminder for everybody, the PTASP regulation, and I know we probably all know this by now, but just as a reminder, the PTASP regulation establishes requirements for a safety management system, an SMS. And at a high level, that includes safety management policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. So safety risk assessment, which is the key focus of today's webinar, that's what we're going to be getting into in more detail, is part of that safety risk management component, that top blue arrow that you see on your screen. One more quick reminder to set the stage. We want to discuss very briefly safety risk assessment from a review perspective. So safety risk assessment, I'm sure, as all of us know, it's going to start with the hazard and the associated potential consequence that an agency has identified through its hazard identification process. And we also know that most hazards are probably going to have more than one potential consequence. But keeping in mind that agencies typically assess one potential consequence of a hazard at a time. Now, our goal in safety risk assessment is to identify the likelihood and the severity of that potential consequence, the likelihood and the severity. And taking those two pieces together, we create this composite, which we call safety risk. So safety risk, it's the result of our assessment. It's a composite of the likelihood and severity determinations. And of course, just as a note, one thing we do want to mention is that whenever we do safety risk assessments, we have to make sure that we take into account any existing mitigations that exist in our system when we're trying to determine the safety risk. And also, I promise, I told you we weren't going to do a lot of review. We're almost done with it, I promise. But we do want to make sure we're on the same page with our very basic definitions. The first, severity. When we talk about severity, we mean how serious the effects of a potential consequence could be. We're talking about how bad it could get, right? And we can use multiple metrics to assess severity. We can consider the impacts of that potential consequence on people, on our transit system, on the environment. Right? There are different ways in which we can consider severity. And likelihood, our other component of safety risk. And this tells us how likely the potential consequence is to happen at our agency. And like with severity, there's many different ways in which we can measure likelihood. Right? Some things that make some general sense. We can think about it in how often that we anticipate something could happen. And we could think about it in terms of how often is this going to happen per year or per month or per boarding or per vehicle mile. Right? There are different ways in which we could choose to measure the likelihood of a potential consequence. And these definitions are important. And it's important to specifically define them, especially when we're talking about likelihood and severity, to help prevent a misunderstanding. So for example, if we say that the potential consequence associated with this hazard is expected to occur often, well, one individual might think often means that this could happen very frequently, maybe hourly. And then you talk to another person at the agency, and to them, often might mean once a day, or maybe even once a week for another individual, or based on their perspective, often could mean once a month. So the more specific we are with our metrics, especially when we're performing safety risk assessment, the easier it is to ensure that everyone can be on the same page. Now, once we've determined safety risk, we can use that determination, that rating, to decide where this hazard should fall within our agency's overall hazard prioritization structure. And this brings us to a very important key point from today's webinar about prioritization and considering what safety risk assessment gives us. Right? The safety risk assessment, ultimately, it's a snapshot based on information and data that's available to our agency at the time in which we're doing the assessment, and upon which our agency can take that assessment to ultimately inform its decision. Right? So it's information that helps the agency make a decision. And importantly, safety risk assessment is not a replacement for the decision-making process. Instead, it's really just one of many elements that an agency is going to consider when it makes decisions. So what drives our safety risk assessment? Right? It's the topic, it's really the focal point of today's webinar. It's data. Right? So it's pretty obvious. Data is going to be a critical component of our safety risk assessment process. Right out of the gate, data can help us determine what specific potential consequence we're going to assess. Data is going to be fundamental in helping us assess the severity, how bad it could get, and the likelihood, how often it could happen, of that potential consequence. So our ability then to actually get the data and information to use, and our ability to actually use it and leverage it effectively, is going to be critical for the success of our safety risk assessments. And so typically we think of the data that can support safety risk assessments as falling into one of these two categories: quantitative and qualitative data. And so quantitative data, right, and I think most of us understand this, it's information that we can quantify. We can count it, we can measure it, right? We can express it in a specific number, give it a numerical value. And then our other bucket of data, qualitative data, right? Information that can be expressed in descriptive language as opposed to a discrete number. So thinking about quantitative data and quantitative data sources, and also qualitative data sources within our organization. And also, it's a really important point to think that when we use data for safety risk assessment, we need to understand that our agency is already collecting a tremendous amount of data and information that can be very valuable for the safety risk assessment process. It may be being collected and maintained not for the specific purpose of supporting safety risk assessments, but it could be a very valuable driver for safety risk assessments. You can think about the great information you may collect at your agency as part of your maintenance information systems, maybe your ops monitoring systems, or an agency's employee reporting program. So as long as you can access the data, then you probably have a tremendous amount of data from which to pull to support safety risk assessment. And with that, brings us to our next poll. And we talked a little bit about general level, the data. What we're going to start getting into are challenges related to that data. So we would like to hear from our participants today if you or your agency has faced challenges in using data to support your agency's formal safety risk assessment determination. So in actually determining likelihood and determining severity. So we're going to launch the poll, and we're going to ask you to choose from 4 options. If you've had challenges related to qualitative data, if you've had challenges related to quantitative data, maybe both, or maybe you're not sure. So we'll give everyone a little time to fill out the next poll. All right, we really appreciate everyone's feedback. And as we can see, data can be a challenge. And over half of our participants are expressing that they've had challenges in dealing with both qualitative and quantitative data. So I guess the numbers speak that obviously you're not alone. And we're going to talk about just some of these challenges specifically. And also we're going to get opportunity to hear from some of your colleagues in the industry about how they deal with those challenges. But first, we're going to cover a few of the common ones. Now, as we all know, data don't just come from one source, right? Instead, can come from many, many different sources. On top of that, they can take many different forms. They can look different. So one example of a data challenge, perhaps your agency has absolute ton of information coming from your system. You're getting a flood of information from your maintenance systems and your employee safety reporting program and your ops monitoring system. But the challenge is sometimes it can be difficult to sort through all of those different sources and that vast amount of data that you're dealing with to actually pinpoint what is the data that's going to be useful for this safety risk assessment. What is relevant to my agency's needs right now for this assessment? Also, sometimes data can overshadow other vital sources of information. And the graphic on your screen is really trying to depict that sometimes data sets can obscure other information. And this obscuring of information can really have a negative downstream impact potentially on your safety risk assessment. And also something to consider here, and this is going to be a message that you're going to hear a little bit today, is that it can be very beneficial to rely on expertise, to rely on specialists within the departments that are the source of the data to help you as an assessment team or an assessor to sort through that information, to understand how to interpret it properly, and to find out what is really pertinent to support your safety risk assessment. So you might have multiple sources of data, and they all seem very relevant, and you got to decide, well, what sources am I going to use to support this safety risk assessment, right? That's one situation. Well, another one is you might have a hazard and a potential consequence, and you can't really find any relevant data. And for individuals that have been in that position, that this can make you really uncomfortable as you're assessing safety risk, right? How am I supposed to tell how often something is going to happen or how bad it could be if I don't have any direct, quantifiable numbers that I can associate with this potential consequence? And this is a situation in which a lot of agencies, and Federal Transit Administration included, will rely on subject matter expertise when there is no other data available to support the assessment. The subject matter experts, and we're talking about you're really experienced staff, the folks that know what's happening and have experienced it on your system, your car mechanics that have been supporting the system forever, your senior operators, your engineers. These are folks that can help guide you when there may not be relevant data at your fingertips. And of course, we also should remember that this subject matter expertise, and frankly, other forms of qualitative data, aren't just important when you're trying to fill in a gap of not having any quantitative data, but they can be just as valuable to help you understand and sort through the quantitative data that you do have. And so thinking about those subject matter experts here, the employees in your agency that can help you with that, perhaps vendors or industry associations, contacts at the lab, really any people that may interact with your system that could provide you extra insight, the experts on this information. They can provide great assistance in making sense of the information that you have access to. And we also want to frame safety risk assessment for consideration as a conversation within the organization. So if we think about it, safety risk assessment is really promoting an informed discussion, right? And this is an informed discussion about what the safety risk is and what level of safety risk is our agency willing to accept. So your key agency stakeholders are a part of this conversation of safety risk, and they help support ultimately leadership decisions on whether to and exactly how to address safety risk. So our goal of safety risk assessment, and we talked about this, we're trying to determine how often something could happen, how bad it could be. So that means we're using the available data, the available information to draw an informed conclusion. And this informed conclusion can help our agency, and our agency can use that in its decision making. So in thinking about it that way, regardless of how much data, how accurate our data is, this effort is predictive. We're trying to determine how often something could happen in the future and how bad it could be. Ultimately, this assessment is subjective. And what does that mean? Well, that means there's really no one correct answer. So our safety risk assessments, it's not like a math problem that we did in school where we wanted to get to that final number that's absolutely correct and we could circle it and get the question right. Our safety risk assessments aren't like that. So for example, likelihood and severity determinations, they could vary. Could vary based on the data that's available at the time. Could vary based on the input from subject matter expertise, input from professional opinion that our agency seeks. Could even find new information or emerging data that changes our determination from what we originally thought. And we shouldn't forget also that safety risk assessment is helping us to determine whether or not this safety risk is really adequately addressed at our agency. So what does adequately addressed mean? Adequately addressed can vary between agencies and also could vary within an agency at different times based on the agency's appetite for safety risk. So one way that agencies can control for these types of variations and uncertainties is to use a tool. And very commonly, agencies use a safety risk assessment matrix. And what this matrix would do for them is establish, ultimately, it's a common language for documenting and communicating safety risk. Now, the next portion that we're going to get to of our webinar, we're going to talk about this documenting safety risk and communicating it in a little more detail. But for now, I'm really excited to welcome our guest presenters. And we're going to ask them to provide some thoughts on their experiences with data and challenges that they've faced related to safety risk assessment. And I'm going to hand the microphone back over to Stuart to introduce today's speakers.
Thanks, Andy. I'm pleased to welcome both of our speakers. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Pursuti. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Des Moines Area Regional Transit Authority, or DART. And in this role, she's overseen the region's largest transformation of public transit in decades, including the reconstitution of DART's Board of Commissioners, an update to the regional property tax formula, the construction and opening of DART Central Station, major redesigns and improvements to DART's bus network of routes, as well as numerous technology advancements to improve ease of use of the DART system. And with more than 20 years of transit industry experience, Elizabeth's previous posts include Chief Development Officer at DART, Service Planning Manager and Bus Operations Project Manager for CATS, the Charlotte Area Transit System, and Senior Associate for Transportation Management and Design Incorporated. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me this afternoon. So DART is the largest public transit agency in Iowa, and we provide or directly operate fixed route services, microtransit, and paratransit services in the region that we serve. We also have a pretty significant van pool program that serves most of central Iowa, and we have nearly 100 vans prior to COVID, and we're about half of that right now. We have 145 buses in our fleet that provide our fixed route and paratransit services. And then prior to COVID, we had provided about 4.5 million rides, and our ridership is about 65%, or back to about 65% of what it was prior to COVID. And then most recently, we have not only added microtransit service that I spoke about earlier, but we've also added 7 electric vehicles into our service mix. So since 2017, DART has been using the risk assessment matrix that Andy spoke about earlier, and has been a really effective tool for us to be able to assess risk and have that common language. And as Andy said, our goal at DART is to reduce risk to the lowest possible level, and recognizing that there are few situations where you can totally eliminate or mitigate all risk. So we have a variety of data systems, as I imagine most transit systems do, that look at that provide us data, both quantitative and qualitative. I think the next slide. Yeah, and so those, from a quantitative standpoint, those include our accident reports. From a planning perspective, we have all of our service-related data from frequency of service boardings, alightings, and so on. We utilize incident reports and injury reports, our telemetry, and then also work closely with our law enforcement agencies and other stakeholders to get data pieces that they may be able to provide us, such as accidents that occur at a given location within our service area and whatnot. From a qualitative standpoint, we use video footage and review that quite extensively when doing risk assessments. We have our employee safety concerns and suggestions and input that we get from our workforce. We rely heavily on our work comp provider and having them assist us in doing assessments in the workplace as it relates to ergonomics, or things in our maintenance shop, and I'm just observing opportunities for us to make improvements in those areas and reduce risk. Observations of things occurring we rely on, as well as just experience and that gut check. Does this look safe in relationship to other things that we've experienced along the way? And then we really look to collaborate with other stakeholders in the community, and working with our all the cities that we serve, and working with their traffic departments, law enforcement, and other groups as well. So we do, while we have a lot of data, sometimes, as Andy said, accessing it can be a challenge. And so on the quantitative side, the benefit of that data is that it's very clear. We're able to make comparisons to the data, but we do sometimes struggle with being able to get the data out of our system and in an automated way to make better assessments of the data and look at it in a very holistic standpoint. From a qualitative standpoint, the information is a little bit more readily available, but I think, as Andy talked about earlier, really making sure that you have a common language and understand what does often mean, or what is the tolerance of risk. That can differ from person to person. So those are challenges we do experience and try to mitigate along the way. A lot of those reports and stuff that I referenced are all manual, and you're keying them in, and there's not always a good way to pull that data out and make those comparisons. So that is something that we're actively working on with our IT department to see if there's opportunities to automate it and be able to bring the data together in a little bit easier fashion so that the assessment doesn't take as long. And then lastly, and something that I'll talk about a little bit more later on in the presentation, is that we do also rely quite heavily on our operators. We do try to engage them in the process as we work through risk assessments. They're our best eyes and ears on the street, but they're also a key stakeholder in understanding the process, so that as they continue in their work and work with their colleagues, that they're sharing why decisions are made. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. It's really great to hear about the breadth of data inputs that you look at and your engagement with operators, and looking forward to hearing more from you a little later on. And now I'd like to introduce Serena Stevenson. Serena is the general manager for the WACO Transit system and transit manager for the McLennan County Rural Transit District in Texas. She's been in the transportation industry for more than 20 years. She's a graduate of the Eno Centers for Transportation and Senior Executive Program, and a member of the Texas Transit Association Board. And Serena is a champion for transit because it's a conduit that provides economic opportunity. It's a safer way to travel, and it reduces the carbon footprint. Serena, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come and visit with you all today. WACO Transit, we're a small urban provider that we operate motor bus and demand response. We have 9 fixed routes. We operate 2 downtown shuttles for the city of Waco. We offer complimentary paratransit. We do some evening link services Monday through Saturday to help individuals who have non-traditional work hours get home as late as 2 a.m. We also operate 7 shuttles for what we call the bus, which is Baylor University service. We operate those Monday through Friday, and we have 2 shuttles that operate on Saturday and Sunday to provide that contracted service for the students. We maintain our own vehicles, and we have our intermodal facility that we lease out to FlexiBus and Greyhound for intercity bus services. We also contract 5310, purchase of service. And again, we have an interlocal agreement between the city of Waco and McLennan County to provide the rural services. And so as we look at safety risk assessment and practice and the process and tools for WACO Transit, we're a small agency. So we have probably about 105 employees all together. And so we have to look at how we implement processes and look at data a little different than larger entities that have like a lot of people resources. And so we have to combine our efforts to make sure that the information we receive is useful, and we have to solicit help from our supervisors, our frontline employees, and really it's a inclusive approach to managing our system. And it's important to us to make sure that we look at the people, our procedures, the environment that we're in, as well as our facilities and our equipment when we're looking at pulling in data to support our safety risk assessment. And so how we use the data, we use it to work towards identifying root causes of a hazard or the safety risk. And then we leverage that data to determine the likelihood and the severity in order to get it down to the most practical level that's acceptable for our organization. Some challenges with using the data is that oftentimes, numbers, when we're talking about quantitative data, the numbers they don't tell us the entire story. We want, and a benefit of numbers is that it's clear and it's not really open to interpretation. But again, when you're a small system, you have to scale down what you have and put it out there to where it's something that your employees first understand the purpose behind it, and then understand the role that they play in, changing the statistics so it's better for the organization as a whole. So one thing that we look at is we look at the years of service for an individual. We also look at our routes. We have a lot of construction in Waco, and so we want to see if where those constructions are, if that's impacting how we do our initial risk rating. We also look at the amount of hours that we have in the workday. I don't know if a lot of you guys were impacted by this great resignation, but for us, we lost drivers. And so we have to factor in how many drivers we have scheduled, how many drivers actually came in. We use those numbers to try to see if those things are impacting where we may have incidents, accidents, or just hazards within our system. We try to also look at our route locations. If there's a lot of construction going on in that area, we look at those specific routes and try to factor that in as well. A lot of times, again, those numbers help us kind of factor down to where a situation could have occurred and why it occurred. But we also try to look at things from a fishbone approach. We sometimes the root cause doesn't always precede the incident. So, we want to be able to see what other factors could have come in play. Did it come from the organization? Was there an organizational failure, or are there human failures that impacted, those numbers? And so again, our initial rating occurs from taking in all that information, scaling it down to what we can use, what we can put out to our operators and our maintenance staff and our support staff, because for us, each person's feedback allows us to kind of bring about organizational change. when it comes down to our quantitative data, we use our video analytics. We again factor in street checks and what the supervisors observe out there in the streets. We also solicit input from our staff. We ask them to ride our routes because from there, they're able to look at situations. The drivers respond a little different when a staff member is driving versus a street supervisor or myself. We get a lot of information from the city of Waco with regards to street closures, events that directly impact our routes. And so the benefit is that is we get more information that can be considered, but a challenge is that sometimes our operators, it's hard for them to realize that we're trying to gather this information from them and other stakeholders, not to take a punitive approach to the situation, but we want to be proactive and help them see that if we do A, B, then we could probably get the result of C. And again, a problematic approach with the data helps to just help us to see that if A happens, B will likely happen. And then we have the opportunity to see how all that is directly related. So for us, the challenges are really just being able to, scale down all the information, make it user friendly, and then helping our employees across the board understand that all of the things that we do is to make the system safer for those that are dependent on it, and communicating it in a simple way that they grasp it, they buy into it, and then they want to provide us that information because ultimately they gain the benefits. I mean, our resources are reserved. We don't have vehicles that are down. And then as we communicate trends and we can show them our incident and our accident frequency rates, how they trend up or trend down, they can see from the information they provided us how they contributed to the overall numbers. And so for us, that's really been how we use our data. Either be when we start looking at our process, when individuals report the hazard, we're able at that point to say, okay, is this something that we need to look at immediately? We try to look at the cost that's associated with it. If it's a lower cost, it's something that we know that we can respond to immediately. And then we try to provide that feedback back out to our operators or to the community. We use a system called Rock Solid. It's a citizens engagement software, and it empowers the city of Waco and WACO Transit system to bridge and engage our citizens. And actually, it's a system that works with all the city departments. And so people are able to communicate to us, people in the community, if there's a hazard that they've identified, and then we'll respond in that system as to what we did, the time frame we were able to do it in, so that they know that their concern was heard. And then if it's going to be something that's going to take us additional resources, we're able to communicate that. We continue to look at this is kind of simple for us because again, we have our site safety council and our accident review board. A lot of our duties are with the same group of individuals, and so we want to make sure that everybody understands the process, where we go in the steps, and that everybody can contribute. As you see, when the report of the hazard is made, we figure out if it turned into an actual event, then we go through the investigative process. It elevates over to our event review team and our accident review board. We talk about the appeals and what could have happened, what did happen. Again, was there human factors, with their organizational failures? And then we take each event or each hazard and we then put them through the risk assessment. And then if disciplinary is needed, then that's not addressed through the site safety team. We're looking at how do we change it and mitigate that, and again, get it down to the most practical level that is possibly acceptable. And so the discipline side of it would go back to operations, and then we would factor in, everything that contributed to it, and then take appropriate action. And then we'll do some follow-ups. We also, we have our safety TVs, and that's a mechanism that we use to report where we're at each month, so that there's not any confusion as to what went to the review board, what we did, what prevention or strategies that we're going to put in place, and the recommendations for the team as a whole. Because again, we're small, so we try to be very transparent about what we're doing and the process that we have in place to make sure that we create that buy-in, and that there's not any, whispering about, what happened here and what happened there. It's really collaborative in how we choose to address it. But again, our major challenge, I would have to say, is just being a small agency. We have limited resources, so we're really about scaling down and putting bite-sized pieces out there so that we can be compliant, we can make the changes necessary, we can assess our risk, we can mitigate it down, but we use, again, an overall approach to getting the change that we need.
Serena, thanks so much. That was really, really excellent insight. And I want to thank Elizabeth as well, for both of you, for your insights. And now, as we turn to the final topic on getting more into safety risk ratings and decision-making, let's take our last audience poll. So you'll see the poll up on screen momentarily, and it asks about the tools and mechanisms that your agency uses to assign safety risk ratings. And as you take that poll, I'm going to hand the microphone back over to Andy for our final topic.
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks, Elizabeth and Serena, as well as all of our participants, for your help on this poll question. And as we can see, wow, so 36% of our participants are using the sample risk assessment matrix that was provided by FTA. Let's see, it looks like the next one is MIL Standard 882, which with 20%. And there is a fair percentage, 16, with a different risk matrix. And then we do have folks that they're using a completely different method. That's very interesting that that's spread out. And I think that that's really important. And we'll talk, that'll actually weave very well into our next section, because we're going to talk about what do we do with the results of our risk assessment. Now, as we talked earlier, we discussed how the purpose of this assessment is to give us this risk rating, right? Composite of likelihood and severity, so we can communicate that to leadership to support decision making. Now, we should also recall from earlier today, safety risk composite of a potential consequences, likelihood and severity, right? We call that the safety risk rating. Why do we do that? It helps an agency rank, prioritize, determine next steps for mitigation. As we've talked about, typically agencies are going to use a matrix, and right in our example, it looked like maybe about 70% used some type of matrix, and some others used other specific procedures that could indicate or recommend or prescribe actions to take based on the risk rating. So some agencies, and I think most folks are probably used to seeing this, we saw some examples already today of this color-coded matrix. Very often we see the red, yellow, green indicators that help to help color code what specific recommendations are associated with that risk rating. So for example, in the chart below on your screen, a safety risk that is that's color coded red could mean that this is unacceptable and that this is going to require action. Perhaps the yellow coding says that this is acceptable with additional management review. And green could mean that the risk is acceptable to the agency with no further action, or perhaps just continued monitoring of the consequence. Now, your safety risk assessment chart could be simpler than even the ones we're looking at here, or they could be tremendously more complex. And that's completely fine. And as we saw from our poll, some folks don't even have a matrix. Right? They're using a different approach. We also, in reviewing agency safety plans, where transit agencies define their safety risk assessment process, we've seen that some agencies actually will use different matrices depending on different situations. So what type of potential consequences? An agency may actually decide to use one chart or another based on the specifics of that potential consequence. Now, although our safety risk assessment chart or our matrix, whatever tool or procedure we're using, may result in an indication that an action should be taken, obviously we have to remember that the safety risk assessment is one piece of information in the agency's overall decision-making puzzle. It's just one of many inputs, right, that an agency is going to consider when making decisions. So ultimately, an accountable executive is going to have to decide on whether action is necessary to mitigate the safety risk that's been assessed, right, using all of these different inputs. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the ultimate action that an agency takes in response to a safety risk assessment, in reality, could possibly differ from the recommended action that came out of the assessment. Right? So with that, we're going to invite our speakers back on to talk a little bit more about this step in the process and how safety risk assessments support decision-making at their agency. And first up, we'd like to welcome Serena back to talk about her agency's experience with ratings and informing agency action. Serena?
All right. So with regards to our agency, WACO Transit, when we're looking at the risk assessment, we're looking at how we can make informed decisions regarding the resolution of hazards, and we base that on the risk involved. So we will look at the hazard severity, and we'll use a quantitative measure to kind of look at the worst credible mishap. And then when we're looking at the likelihood, we're using a quantitative assessment that the hazard will occur. Now, we realize that it's hard to move that needle from catastrophic, but it's easier to move it, to make it more manageable. So what we try to do is say, like I said, we found it easier to make things less likely and harder to make things less catastrophic. And so what we do is, during our first process, we will sit down and we'll look at all kinds of factors. We try to look at when the route was designed, was it designed so that there was minimal risk? We try to look at if there is something that's serious. We try to figure out how can we work that hazard to where we can get it as small and probable as possible, because we realize that a lot of times it's just hard to eliminate risk as a whole. And so it's always a possibility, but again, how can we get it down to a level that's manageable? So we'll look at, should we incorporate some type of safety device, or do we need to look at some type of warning system? What can we do that's practical and that is cost effective and that we can get done in the immediate in order to resolve or mitigate the risk? And so a lot of times though, with us being smaller, we're in a position where, did we budget for that? If not, how can we reallocate funds in order to address a concern? So then a lot of times we're left down to looking at our procedures and the training. We're looking at how can we reinforce what we need to get done with what we have in our hands to get it done. It's not always a lot of money for us. Sometimes it's getting creative and figuring out how you create that buy-in and what can we reasonably do that's feasible and in the moment to bring that risk down. And so when we're really looking at something that's high and catastrophic, for instance, let's say if a bus may fall off a lift or in the maintenance department, those are things that, they're going to take a high priority. And so we're going to look at how was the training? Was it flushed to the ground? Did the maintenance individual, was he aware of, all of our safety protocols? And, because a lot of times it's just about ensuring that communication is constant when it comes down to our safety. Sometimes when I first came here, it was all about the operators. And so we've tried to change that mindset to where it's maintenance as well as the operators. We want to make sure that, a mirror strike or a vehicle falling off are handled in the same timely manner. As far as communicating what we do and how we do it, we have safety TVs throughout our facilities. We have it in our maintenance department. We have them in our ready rooms at both of our facilities. And for us, communicating safety trends is so important so that people understand the direction that we're moving. We have a newsletter that we put out so that they can see the initial risk rating, and then we'll let them know once we've communicated if something has gone into a hazard area. We show them where we mitigated that risk down, and we show how what they did contributed to the next level. We've learned that communication is key. I mean, we've learned that you can't make the excuses because of the amount of money that you have or you don't have. We have found that it's essential that everyone in our organization knows what part they play. They know their role. I mean, regardless that I may be the accountable executive, I'm out there, I'm leading by example. I'm going to wear a safety vest if I'm walking the yard. I expect my maintenance director to do the same. And so that way they see that this is in practice across the board. It's just not because I'm not washing the buses or I'm just going to put some trash out, that I'm just walking through and not showing that, safety is a priority for us. I live it, I'm an example of it. And I think that that's how we create that buy-in. As far as our experiences learned and the suggestions for other transit providers, all I can say is that you have to look at your resources, you have to learn your people, and you have to be a part of the solution. You can't say, we're small, we don't have time. Put it on your calendar. Make Monday your safety day. Get creative with your staff. Buy candy bars and put safety messages on it. You have to figure out how you can manage your organization and you can get the message out, because it's doable. You have to get creative. If you don't have subject matter experts, I suggest that you take advantage of the TSI classes. You figure out what you can read and how you can develop yourself, and you have to have an innate desire to do better so your organization can be better. A lot of times it's easy to say, if I had an engineering department at WACO Transit, they could come in and, do a preliminary hazard analysis and all those great things that, larger systems have, but we don't have it. So we have to make do with what we have in order to enhance the service delivery and the safety for our organizations. So again, communicating, newsletters, safety boards, safety bulletins, I mean, using some of the safety websites that have, I mean, there's one out there that has a toilet tabloid. Those are the ways that you get the message out. You just get creative and you be a part of the solution. And so another thing that we use, next slide, please, is when I talked about communicating our safety data, we take in consideration each fiscal year. And so in 21, we kind of looked at our data. We communicate this again every month. We make sure that quarterly we're putting up, you know, any areas of concern, any things where we've seen patterns of behaviors occurring. And then we make sure that they know what they did well throughout the year, because I mean, it's easy to beat people down and tell them, you know, we had another accident, but you know, when you're communicating that, you know, things are trending up in some areas, then, you know, people say, okay, we are doing something better. I mean, everybody likes a little positive enforcement. We do safety breakfasts, we do safety cookouts, you know, if we've gone so many days without a preventable accident. And then if there is an incident or accident, we do our best to communicate, you know, how this could have been prevented. We give that initial rating, and then we'll follow up after we've done an action plan to show, you know, what happened and then how we mitigated that risk down. Next slide, please. This is again our data trends for 2021, and where we could identify some areas where we could have had some improvements and then some areas of concern. And so I want to kind of show you how, after looking at the data that we do have and looking at how our initial ratings were and how we mitigated things down for 2022. Could you go to the next slide, please? We added in some additional features. We put in like a zone goal. So you can see where we put in the zone goals, and we kind of, I mean, Excel seems to be our best friend. It's easy to manage. I mean, again, we're small, so, you know, we have a lot of spreadsheets. And so I just took those data and made some, put some formulas in so that each month as we enter in, you know, how many incidents we had or accidents we had and what category they were, they relate back to a target. And so you see, we put in a zone goal for the fiscal year so that hopefully our incident accident frequency rates wouldn't increase higher than the previous fiscal year. And then it gives our operators and our staff and our maintenance department, you know, information on where we're trending, how we're trending, and then we give them feedback during our meetings and on our safety boards and in our newsletters as to the trends and some specifics. But we also this year wanted to factor in the injury causes. And so you see where we put in some new data to kind of track it for fiscal year 22 as far as injury causes as well as our collision causes. And then we're able to kind of look at where trends are and then give it an initial rating. You know, was this something that happened because this was a first year driver? Was this a driver that's been here 3 years and maybe in the first year they were nervous, the second year they got pretty comfortable, the third year they just thought they knew it, and then maybe we had some increased accidents due to those factors, or, you know, just different things that we want the operators to know to stay vigilant. Safety is, again, an organizational, it is something that we buy in as the organization as a whole, and it's not one person's responsibility, it's all of our responsibility. And so being able to communicate this and be transparent and give them some details has really helped with us changing some of our trends. And with respect to our, you know, our communication methods, we definitely have seen where they enjoy the safety TVs, because we can do like little cute little commercials about A, B, C, and D. We can put safety blurbs up. We can meet them, and if they know Like we may have a saying out for the month that says like, when in doubt, don't. And so we may put that somewhere, and if they find it, they can turn it in. It's just little reminders that say, if you're in doubt about doing something, if you're in doubt about trying to, maneuver what could potentially be a collision, but maybe a hazard in this moment, just don't do it. There's a support system here to help you navigate our system. And so little things like, when in doubt, don't. If they find that on their wheel, when they're doing their pre-trip in the morning, they can turn that in, and, they'll get a candy bar that has some type of safety message on it. And again, it's the little things that we're able to give them that shows that we hear you. You're important to us. You're the greatest asset for WACO Transit. And I think that we're seeing some positive behavior changes because of the intense amount of time that we spend, focusing on safety. And so, so that's it for our safety data, our trends, how we reported, our experiences, and the lesson learned primarily is scale it down and do the best you can with what you have to work with, because reaching out to other organizations, as they said earlier, there are resources that are available. Sometimes you just have to reach out and ask, how are you managing this? And I'm pretty sure you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've got plenty of transit professionals and people who want us all to succeed. And so I always lean on the industry peers to try to help me where I may feel like being smaller, I'm a little limited. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Serena, thank you so much. We appreciate all of your experience on this topic. Now I'd like to welcome Elizabeth back to speak about her agency's experiences. Elizabeth?
Great, thank you. As Serena shared about WACO, at DART, we do many of the same things as it relates to sharing information, the information we collect, and having dashboards to view the information readily. But I thought I'd share with you today a little bit on how we've approached the risk assessment process, specifically as it relates to our operators. One of the things that we have been doing more regularly is, wanting to educate them and inform them about the process and the system and the importance of safety. And so I have two examples here today where we held some sessions with operators and actually walked them through the risk assessment process. What was interesting as we worked through both of these examples with them, we held 3 different sessions where we had a large number of operators participate in all of the sessions. And at the end of it, they all came out with the same answer as it relates to how best to in the determination of the risk. And so when we've worked with operators, we really have wanted to talk to them about the severity of the impact, what's the worst unwanted event that's likely to occur with a risk, the frequency or how often is it likely to occur, the rate or time of onset, how often is the hazard present, as well as historical data, what has happened in the past. And so here's an example where we have a downtown circulator or a circulator service in our downtown area. And the operator, or we had a request or felt like it was a risk. One of the turns or part of the route, there were always, there's a lot of pedestrians, there's delivery vehicles, and parked cars in the area. And so walk through kind of the assessment with the operators and did it ourselves as staff. And some of the things that we looked at while making the assessment is, is it, how often, all those factors that I talked about earlier in terms of the historical data, how often, frequency, and severity of impact. And so as we made that assessment, the hazard wasn't always present in a large number of, or in large numbers. We had only had one preventable accident and no injuries in 3 years. Doing this routing of the route, it's fairly low speed, and there wasn't really an alternate routing available to actually have the service where the people are. And so it was really neat to walk through this exercise with the operators. And at the end of the day, they came to the same conclusion we did, is that the maintaining this route and maintaining is a fairly low risk. And so we maintained the current route to meet the riders' needs. The next slide. Another example that we worked with our operators on and talked with them about is the placement of our mobile data terminal on the vehicles. We had it in one location and then had moved it to another one, and there were some concerns by our operators about the new placement of the NDT, and that there was the potential for glare and some shaking of the MDTs themselves. So we walked through the risk assessment with them and assessing whether to move the MDT or not. And our assessment, keeping it where it was, or in the upper left corner of the driver's compartment. We utilized workers' comp data. We had the severity was marginal, but the likelihood of occurrence was fairly probable in terms of having more work comp injuries or issues with that current placement. And so the risk score of the where the MDT was previously was fairly serious. It was undesirable, and correction would be required. So we did the assessment also where we relocated the MDT to near the fare box, also used our work comp data, and that the likelihood of occurrence came to the conclusion that the likelihood, or that data indicated that the likelihood of occurrence was going to be occasional and the severity was negligible. And so the risk score was low, and we determined that keeping that location of the MDT near the fare box was acceptable, and that no further action would be required. So these are just two examples of different sorts of risk assessments we do and thinking about it, and also just working with our frontline staff to understand kind of the process, and also them using the process and the matrix to understand kind of why we come to the outcomes that we did. So the process for us really provides more confidence in the decision making process based on the data, and provides a better communication path and responding to requests. So as we continue to move forward and thinking about our process and improvements to it and the data associated, we are continuing to look at how we leverage our systems to get better data and leverage the data that we have. We're also, as we think about, as Serena had mentioned, there is often a lot of focus on our operators, and we are looking at how do we get better data in other areas of the operation, such as maintenance. And so one of the things that we're exploring is some different sort of wearables that in the maintenance area that can track, noise levels, air quality, and those sorts of things, so that we can ensure that try to be preventative in our measures and understanding the environment, rather than waiting for something to happen that we have to address. So appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and just look forward to the discussion next.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to Serena as well. It's really valuable to hear your perspectives, the initiatives that you're taking within your agencies, and what you're learning and how that's informing your safety risk management processes and the outcomes for your operators and your customers and your communities. And with that, that's wraps up our formal presentation, and we're going to switch into a Q&A momentarily. But before we do that, just a couple of reminders. I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that the survey that we offered at the end of the February webinar and some examples of how we integrated that into today's webinar. And we hope you've found that valuable and useful in this presentation. And when you leave this webinar, when the webinar wraps up, you'll get another opportunity to take a survey for this month. And we want to encourage everyone to complete that survey. It's going to help us understand what's valuable to you and what we can continue to enhance and refine and develop in these webinars. And the second thing I want to spend just a couple of minutes on is some resources that are available to you. So we focused obviously on safety risk management, specifically safety risk assessment today. And there are a number of resources in the PTASP resource library that are including previous webinars, some tools, matrices and fact sheets related to SRM and safety risk assessment. Those are available at transit.dot.gov/PTASP-TAC. And again, we know some of you may have questions about the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we recommend visiting FTA's bipartisan infrastructure law website at fta.dot.gov/BIL. And we recently published an FAQ that's specific to some of the changes to PTASP from the bipartisan infrastructure law requirements. And that FAQ is available at the bipartisan infrastructure law website. We hope that you find that useful. And as always, if you have additional questions that are specific to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we encourage you to email fta-iija@dot.gov. And just in case you haven't visited our PTASP-TAC website recently, I just want to give you a quick pointer on how you can find some of the resources that are available related to this topic. So when you visit the PTASP website, you'll see a link for the PTASP resource library. When you select that, you'll see, as on screen here, you can choose resources based on your agency type, and that includes small bus transit providers, bus, rail, state safety oversight agencies, state DOTs, and MPOs. And select your organization type or agency type. And in there, you'll see resources grouped by various topics, including safety risk management. And in the safety risk management section, you'll see, call your attention to a couple of items that are available. So under training, there's a self-guided learning tool for PTASP hazards and consequences. Under webinars, there's a webinar that we offered just about a year ago on implementing safety risk assessment approaches. The presentation for that is available. This is also where the recording and slides for today's webinar will be linked as soon as we have them ready in a couple of days or so. They'll be available on this page as well. And then there's some other tools, including I know that a number of you are using the safety risk assessment matrices that are available from FTA, the sample one. That's available under the tools section. So if you need a refresher on that or want to look at using it, it's available for you there. And lastly, you'll see that there's, if you need to reach out to us, if you have additional questions, we encourage you to email us at ptasp-tac@dot.gov. And with that, we will, and I'll just mention that we are, the TAC is available to help assist the industry with questions about ASP development, implementation, evaluation, review, and oversight. And you can also call the help desk from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday at 877-827-7243.